Hello and welcome to AmericanNavalHistory.com. My name is John Sorensen, and this is a series of lessons intended to teach the history of the United States Navy. Our Navy has a long and proud history of being a global force for good. In this lesson about the Barbary pirate wars, I've called an audible here and made a last-minute decision. And instead of doing it in two parts, I've decided to do it into three parts. There just seem to be too many things that have actually happened during the fighting of this war to try to squeeze it into one 20-minute lesson. So it looks like there's plenty of material here to go into make it into a three-part lesson. So I don't want to leave anything out, but I don't think I'm covering it in too much detail to bore everybody, and I'm trying to keep it enjoyable and interesting. So, but in the three parts seems to cover everything that needs to be covered. So I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for listening to AmericanNavalHistory.com. When the Bashaw of Tripoli heard how much of a tribute the United States was paying to the Dey of Algiers, he got jealous and he wanted more for himself. So he's the one that sent the letter to the United States to President Adams asking for a higher tribute, and he gave President Adams 6 months or else he would start a war against the United States. Well, what happened was the letter took 5 months to get there, and by the time it got there, John Adams was no longer the president. He had been defeated by Thomas Jefferson, and by the time Jefferson got the letter, it was 2 weeks into his administration, 9 days after his inauguration, and the letter was 5 months old, and there was, even if he wanted to pay the tribute, he wouldn't have had enough time to do it. So, and he didn't want to do it. So, you know, although he did want to cut down the size of the Navy and everything like that, he was not going to pay a blackmail, not in the name of the United States anyway. So, he decided that he was going to send a fleet of ships over there to investigate the situation. So Jefferson and Benjamin Stoddard got together and they began assembling a task force to go over to the Mediterranean to observe the situation and to protect American ships that were over there at the time. And here in the slides a list of the main ships that went. Anyways, their orders were not to initiate hostility, but to gather the American merchant ships up for convoys and hang around the convoys with the armed naval vessels to protect them from the Barbary pirates, prevent the Barbary pirates from causing any trouble. And so they went over to the Mediterranean. They actually got to the Mediterranean on July 1st, 1801. And they anchored in the British port of Gibraltar. And when they got there, the two Tripolitan ships, or corsairs, which were small little warships, they were at anchor in Gibraltar already. So not being at war against Tripoli and being ordered, you know, not to start hostilities, they just anchored in the same port. The American fleet from there scattered throughout the Mediterranean to gather up American ships into convoys. But since there were already two corsairs in Gibraltar, the Philadelphia was ordered to remain in Gibraltar to watch those two corsairs. Okay, the Essex was sent along the northern coast of the Mediterranean to gather up American ships to start assembling these convoys, and they got up to Gibraltar. Now Gibraltar, or not Gibraltar, they got up to Barcelona, and Barcelona is not marked on this map, but if you see the word Spain and you go directly to the right to the coast, it's on the very northern Mediterranean coast of Spain, about as far up as you can get towards the French border in Spain. Anyways, the Essex went up to Barcelona, and there they got into a little bit of trouble, but it wasn't military trouble. It was more, kind of a little incident occurred between the sailors in port, between the Essex and there was a Spanish ship also in port there called the Xebec. And the sailors started getting jealous of each other, started criticizing. They did what sailors do when you get in port, and lot of verbal tongue lashing went back, and trash talk went back and forth between the Spanish sailors and the American sailors in port. And Stephen Decatur was a junior officer on the Essex, and the captain of the Essex was William Bainbridge, and remember him from the quasi-war against France. Anyways, Stephen Decatur was a junior officer under that, and he got kind of involved with a lot of this was going on in port between the Spanish sailors and the American sailors, and he actually challenged one of the Spanish officers to a duel. Okay, but Captain Bainbridge and the Spanish civil authorities didn't let that happen. So no violence really did occur, but it was sort of an incident, and one of those things that happen when sailors get in port. So that was the tale of the Essex. The President and the Enterprise, they sailed to Algiers. Now, the war was declared by the Bashaw of Tripoli, not by the Dey of Algiers. See, the Bashaw of Tripoli, what he did, he actually went to the American consulate in Tripoli and cut down the flagpole with the American flag on it, and that's how they declared war in that area, in that part of the world. They just went to your consulate, cut down the flagpole, and Tripoli was at war with the United States. Now Algiers wasn't. Remember, we paid them their tribute that they wanted, and they really didn't. They weren't really involved, but they were kind of thinking, well, maybe we will go to war against the United States. But the President and the Enterprise showed up in Algiers, and these frigates were powerful ships. And when the Dey of Algiers saw these two ships in port, they decided, nah, we're not going to go to war against the United States. That war was declared by Tripoli, and we're going to let Tripoli fight that war, and we're at peace with the United States, and we do intend to stay that way, especially with those frigates like that. We're not going to be against them. Now I want to talk about the first real battle of the war. It was the President and the Enterprise were off together, and the President was of course the big frigate. That was the Commodore Richard Dale's flagship, and the Enterprise was a smaller little schooner it was a 12-gun schooner, and they sent the Enterprise off by itself to Malta on a short little mission, and while it was on that mission, it came upon a Tripolian ship called the Tripoli, and it was a Corsair, which was about the size of a schooner. It had a 14-gun. It was a 14-gun ship. And a battle ensued, and they fired their cannons at each other for about 2 hours, and the American gunnery was much more accurate and much more effective than the Tripoli's gunnery was. So the Tripoli tried to come alongside a couple times and grapple the Enterprise, but you got to give credit to the American Marines that were on board the Enterprise, because they would fire their muskets whenever the Tripoli would get up close enough to start grappling, and they would clear the decks, and there was no way that Tripoli could grapple, so that they could not board the American Enterprise. So the Americans were able to make this more of a gunnery battle at a distance, at which they weren't getting hit at all, and they were just absolutely pummeling the Tripoli. And after a while, you could just see all the damage and the carnage on deck. on the Tripoli. So the captain of the Tripoli, he lowered his flag, which is the international signal for I surrender, I give up, and you can come alongside, and the battle's over. So when the Americans came to claim their prize and take their prisoners, what the Tripoli did was raise their flag back up, and they tried to grapple, come alongside, and take and board the Enterprise. But again, you got to give credit to the United States Marine Corps, and they would not let the Tripolian sailors grapple the Enterprise. And as they got close, they fired their muskets and did not let the Tripoli enact their plan that they had. And again, the two ships were separated at a distance again, and the Enterprise kept giving broadsides to the Tripoli, and much more carnage. The damage, the rigging was falling, and sailors were wounded and dying on the Tripoli, and the Enterprise was barely hit at all. So it was basically a one-sided battle, and the Americans were getting definitely the best side of it. And then again, the Tripoli tried it again. They lowered their flag to fake another surrender. But this time the American captain wasn't going to be fooled. He kept his men at general quarters, kept the guns loaded, and kept the Navy, he kept the Marines on alert, and kept the Navy gunfire teams on their guns. And as they approached to receive the surrender, once again they saw that it was a trick, it was a trap, and they fired. Both sides started firing at each other, and the battle continued. And as it continued, the Tripoli lost all capability to maneuver, it lost all capability to fire back, and they had absolutely no scratches on the Enterprise at all. And yet the Enterprise wasn't going to be fooled again, and they just kept firing and firing and firing, causing more and more damage and more death. And it got to be where the American sailors didn't want to fire anymore. It was a hopeless situation for the Tripoli, and it was slaughter, and they did not, they just humanitarily did not want to do that. But then again, these guys were not to be trusted with a surrender. So finally, the captain of the Tripoli took his flag down and threw it in the ocean, so there's no way that he could raise it again, which was a symbol like, this time I really mean it. We're going to surrender. And the American ship, the Enterprise, took every precaution, grappled up next to it, and took the prize and took the prisoners, and there were no incidents. And they really were not authorized, because war had not been declared, to take the prize. So what they did is they did as much damage as they could. They took every gun and every cannon, every knife, and everything on board and threw it over the side. Anything that they could be used to fight with, they threw over the side. They threw all the gunpowder overboard, all the rigging. They shredded all the sails. They cut down the masts. They just made this Tripoli into a floating raft, and they rigged up one small sail on one small mast so that these guys could get back home. And they went home with a message. And that message from the captain of the Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Sterrett, to the Bashaw Tripoli, and the message was, the next time you want a tribute from the United States, it's going to be gunpowder and cannonballs, and that's the only tribute that you're going to get from the United States of America. After the defeated crew aboard the defeated Tripoli arrived back to the city of Tripoli, they delivered the message to the Bashaw, the message that the American captain had given to them. And that was the message that any future tribute that he would receive from the United States would come in the form of cannonballs and gunpowder. The Bashaw of Tripoli was very, very upset about this, and he ordered that all the men that survived that battle, anybody that came back, the ones that were living, to be paraded around the city on the back of donkeys. One book actually used the term jackasses. This was a terrible insult in their culture. It was very degrading and very embarrassing to these men. It was. Then they were cast out of the city. They were basically kicked out of town. And the captain, he received 500 blows on the soles of his feet as punishment. And they were all punished for losing that battle. And the Bashaw was very, very angry at the American Navy. He wanted to send out his entire fleet against the United States Navy. But he only had one problem, and he only had one big problem. It was that he could not recruit any crew members for his, to man up to go on this mission. No sailors in the whole country wanted to go out to fight, to hunt down and fight against the American Navy. They were too afraid to go out and fight against the United States Navy. After all, their best ship with their best captain had just been severely beaten and slaughtered and there was most of the crew died. But their best ship and their best captain had been severely beaten by a small American schooner. Now, what would have happened if they had met up with an American frigate that had, 4 times the gunpowder that the schooner had? Now, it would be a year. It would take a whole year before the Bashaw could reman his fleet and put his navy back out to sea. And when news of this battle reached the 2 ships that were at anchor in Gibraltar, the crew members of those 2 ships deserted. They left those ships right there at anchor in Gibraltar, and they just deserted. So the Philadelphia that had been left in Gibraltar to watch those 2 ships, basically their mission was completed because those 2 ships that they were watching were now crewless. When the first task force returned from the Mediterranean, Thomas Jefferson realized that he was in a real war. And he also realized that this was a naval war and that he had to abandon his plans for dismantling the Navy. Remember, he had come into office wanting to make the smaller government with less taxes and do away with the Navy almost. So he realized at that point that he really could not do that because he needed the Navy. He put together another task force under the command of Captain Richard Morris. And this task force, the second task force to go over to the Mediterranean, they arrived in Gibraltar in late May of 1802. They had hit a couple storms at sea and they got separated, but by the time they all got there, it was the end of May in 1802. Now this fleet didn't really do a whole lot of anything over there in the Mediterranean. They did conduct one moderately successful raid on about a dozen Tripolitan grain ships that were at anchor over there in the Mediterranean, kind of outside of Tripoli, not really in Tripoli, but outside of Tripoli, right near Tripoli. About a dozen grain ships were at anchor, and they sent rowboats over there full of men to cut those ships on fire and burn all the grain. And apparently a lot of musket shots at them, and they basically had to row their boats under a hail of bullets, a hail of musket balls. And they burned about half the ships, and that was about the extent of anything that this fleet had done over there. So they said they were moderately successful at that raid, but that was it. I mean, that one raid was it, okay? But other than that, they really didn't do much of anything. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson relieved Morris in June of 1803 for non-activity because he just wasn't over there getting the job done. So Jefferson relieved him of his duties. Okay, his court of inquiry found that, this is a quote. Okay, this is what the court of inquiry said about him. He did not conduct himself and his command of the Mediterranean squadron with the diligence or activity necessary to execute the important duties of his station. And after that, he was dismissed from the United States Navy. Basically, he was fired. And we're going to have to tie it off there because the third mission over there had two very, very heroic things happen with the Philadelphia and the shores of Tripoli with the Marine Corps. So I cannot squeeze that onto the end of this part of the lesson. So I'm gonna break it up and put a third part of the lesson about for that third fleet that goes over to the Mediterranean, because they were just a beehive of activity, we'll say. So I'm going to tie it off there. Thank you for listening to AmericanNavalHistory.com.